Welcome to Beyond Belief. I'm George Noory. You know, on this program, we seek the truth. That's what we're looking for. We want answers to questions about all kinds of things, including UFOs, unidentified flying objects. What are they? Where do they come from? Our special guest on Beyond Belief is Nick Pope. Nick used to work for the Ministry of Defense in Great Britain. He had the ability to actually look at UFO files. Nick, welcome to Beyond Belief.
Thank you, George. It's great to be on the show.
When you were looking at these files, when you were at the Ministry of Defense, what did you see? I mean, my gosh, was it a huge folder? What were they?
Lots of folders. I mean, literally thousands of them. The British government is in the process of declassifying and releasing some of this material. And it's quite funny because for years they said, oh, this subject is of very little interest. And it turns out that so far, over 60,000 documents have been released. So I think that gives you a sense of the scale of it. And this goes back decades.
Now, when you were looking at them, you weren't like Edward Snowden, right? You had the capability of peeking at them, doing whatever you did with them?
Well, I was, of course, an employee of the British government, the Ministry of Defense. So, I mean, I was working on this quite legitimately. I mean, this was my job, my day-to-day business. I investigated the newly reported cases as they came in, but I was able to access the entire back archive of these files. So as long as I didn't inadvertently make anything public, that was fine. I had access all area pass, so to speak.
Or make copies for yourself, Nick?
No, sadly not, though it was very tempting given some of the material. But of course now, with the British government themselves declassifying and releasing some of this material, most of it maybe, it's like a blast from the past for me, seeing some of the case files that I worked on, seeing documents that I wrote, which I thought would never see the light of day.
Give me your overview on just what you think this entire field is, based on the files, based on where you are today.
Big question. I think that it is 99% noise, but 1% signal. And I think as to what that 1% is, I'm not one of these people who sits here and says, I've got an ultimate answer to the entire mystery. The odd thing, perhaps...
But it is a mystery.
It is a genuine mystery. It's not all aircraft lights, weather balloons, hoaxes. There is something going on. There is a phenomenon. Could it be extraterrestrial? Absolutely. Could it be something else? Who knows? I'm one of these people who am not afraid to say, I don't know. And that's the irony. People say, but you're in government, you should know. Well, actually, government is certainly the British government, which is really, of course, the only one I can talk about with any inside authority. The British government is actually as mystified about some of this as anyone else.
Well, we're getting these declassified files now, as you said, and Paul Hellyer, who was the former Canadian Defense Minister, talks about unidentified flying objects. You, talking about the British files, talk about unidentified flying objects. Here at home in the United States, we're trying to get disclosure as well. And people are frustrated, Nick, because we haven't been able to pierce that shell yet. We haven't been able to get government to come out freely and say, this is what is going on. We know about this. Here are the files. They're not doing that. Be that as it may, Hillary Clinton, of course, during the presidential campaign, people thought that if she had gotten elected, we would have had disclosure. There was an initiative called the Clinton Podesta Disclosure Initiative. You were part of that. You looked into that. What did you find?
Well, I met John Podesta in June of 2011. Podesta, of course, had been President Obama's chief of staff. He'd chaired the transition team, and he was running Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Now, I met him at a private briefing in Washington, D.C., and I gave him an overview of the British government's UFO project. And one thing that he was particularly interested in was the way in which we in the Ministry of Defense had rebranded the phenomenon. We had dropped the phrase UFO, and we had replaced it with UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. Now, the reason we did that was that we felt there was too much, I call it pop culture baggage associated with the term. Yeah, absolutely. So now, Podesta was extremely interested in this, and clearly, though I lost sight of exactly how this played out, I didn't take part in subsequent meetings, but I was very interested to see that when Hillary Clinton started talking about this, which was quite extraordinary in and of itself, of course, in the presidential campaign, she used the same phrase, and I thought, hey, I did that.
You got into it.
And she, I think it was the Jimmy Kimmel show, a couple of others, but she actually stopped the interviewer and said, there's a new term for this.
Unexplained aerial phenomenon.
Unexplained aerial phenomenon, really?
Yep, UAP. That's the latest nomenclature.
I like the old one. I like UFO. I don't know why.
Well, I think we can.
And as I say, that's what I had briefed to Podesta as being the way to get this subject viewed in a more serious, less kind of nuanced way.
People were disappointed that in the debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, the issue of these UFOs or UAPs did not come up, and they really wanted the candidates to be asked those questions. That was disappointing.
It was, and it was also quite surprising. Hillary Clinton had talked about this a lot, and I was surprised. I thought it was not a particularly smart move, because I thought, to a whole bunch of people out there, this might be quite attractive. Oh yes, I'm going to open the UFO files. I'm going to look into Area 51. If there's something out there, I'm going to disclose it. But to a whole other group of the population, I felt this ran the risk of portraying her as a crazy. And people would say, hey, look, I'm interested in the jobs situation, the economy,
wars,
tax,
all this stuff.
All that. I'm not interested in little green men. And I actually thought that Donald Trump might raise it unilaterally. Even if a question didn't come from the moderator, he might try and portray Hillary Clinton as some kind of nut job for talking about this. Now, in the end, yes, it was surprising and disappointing that it didn't come up. There was a lot of lobbying. I mean, people said, lobby all the moderators, tell them what questions you want. And there was a huge viral campaign to get this question asked, but it never came up.
It never happened. Now that Donald Trump is the president, will we get disclosure, in your opinion?
Well, I think, I hear people say all the time, oh, this president is going to be the disclosure president. That president's going to be the disclosure.
And we haven't had that happen.
Absolutely not. No, since the disclosure movement really first started, and I guess you could debate about how far that goes back. But we've cycled through a number of presidents, and each time, certain people associated with this say, this is the one, and it never happens. I think, as I think, hopefully an impartial observer on this, that if ever there was a president likely to let the cat out of the bag, Donald Trump is the one. I mean, he has the advantage of not being a career politician, not being hooked into the system. And I could just imagine that if somebody briefs him and says, Mr. President, here's the file on the aliens, he would just come out and
he'll go public. He'll tweet it.
He'll tweet it. He'll tweet it, or he'll be at one of his rallies.
Exist.
Yeah, he'll be at one of his rallies, and when he needs to pull out some big point to maybe if he's dealing with some scandal, as inevitably presidents do, to be able to pull this out of the bag and say, by the way, aliens. I mean, that's just massive. So if ever there was a president that might do it, this is the one.
But will they know? Will these presidents know? I mean, we assume John F. Kennedy knew about extraterrestrials. We think Lyndon Johnson might have been told. What about Richard Nixon? We think he might have been told. Reagan, I'm not sure. Carter wanted answers. I'm not sure they told him. I'm not sure they told Bill Clinton. I'm not sure they told the two Bushes. So what about the possibilities that they just won't tell Donald Trump what's going on?
Well, there are certainly, of course, tensions already between the intelligence community and
this
President Trump. Yes, so it is quite possible that they would take a unilateral decision not to brief him. However, I have to say that in one sense, I disagree. And I know, you can list presidents that you think knew and then some that didn't know. My own take is that if the US government at official level is privy to this, and let's not forget the possibility that this has all been taken outside of government and put in the private sector to make
possible.
Well, makes congressional oversight more difficult, takes it outside the scope of FOI, which is a big thing.
Right.
But let's assume it is in government. I mean, I think in that circumstance, I believe every president would have to be told, and here's why. The president is the commander-in-chief, and what if the whole situation suddenly moves from being mysterious or benign or neutral
to serious?
Yes. The president, as commander-in-chief, would have to take instant command decisions on what the response could be. And no president could make those decisions if they were having to be briefed from the very bottom upwards. So I think it would be incumbent on the whole apparatus of state to make sure the president was pre-briefed on this so that he could make those decisions instantly and from an informed position.
Sounds like the movie Independence Day, doesn't it?
Well, yes, I loved that movie, and I loved the bit, the surprise on the president's face when he finds that out.
But could we really defend ourselves against a hostile extraterrestrial presence?
I suspect not.
I agree.
I think it's one of these. We can only take an anthropocentric view of this phenomenon, but there are one or two assumptions which I think are so fundamental that they are legitimate. And one of those assumptions is that if they come down here, their technology self-evidently is going to be orders of magnitude above and beyond anything we've got. And you could say in human history, what if, we see the examples all the time, of course, looking back through history, when a less technologically advanced culture meets a more technologically advanced culture, almost inevitably it ends badly, and certainly there would be no possibility in any kind of shooting war. Now you can get into a debate about asymmetrical warfare, but I mean, we wouldn't be dealing in a universe 14 billion years old. The statistical chances of our coming across a civilization, say, 100 years ahead of us, are vanishingly small. Far more likely we'll be dealing with civilizations tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of years ahead. And what will their technology look like? Well, as Arthur C. Clarke said, it will be indistinguishable from magic.
Our CIA, Nick, has released some UFO files, albeit some of them are blacked out. But that's pretty dramatic, isn't it?
Absolutely. 13 million documents, I believe, and a classic example, I suspect, and by the way, I haven't had a chance to read them all yet.
No, not all of them. Knowing you, half of them.
Yeah, well, I've skimmed them. But
are they fascinating?
They are. It's a mixed bag. As with all government files, there are a lot of kind of little more than letters from members of the public and polite kind of three-line responses. The really interesting stuff is more the policy discussions about what the phenomenon is, what the implications are from an intelligence point of view. But 13 million documents, I think it's a classic example of the way that governments handle this. They just dump industrial quantities of this information in the public domain.
Good or bad reports, right? They're all in there?
They're all in there. And it's a classic case of the best place to hide a book is in a library. No one can possibly go through all that. And
so you just put it right out there.
They put it out there so it's hidden in plain sight. And what they do, and I've done this myself with the British government's program, and even though I'm retired from the Ministry of Defence, I'm still involved in acting as a spokesperson for this campaign. Very often, I get to pick the cases that I talk about to the media. And the government, of course, wants certain things highlighted, and they want certain things de-emphasized.
Nick, we are in an amazing time right now, and we are in the 70th anniversary of one of the greatest UFO cases in the United States, and that was, of course, Roswell. With the 70th anniversary, people are still talking about this case.
Something happened near the town of Roswell, New Mexico. That event, known as the Roswell incident, has become synonymous with flying saucer crash, alien visitation, government cover-up, or many say a jump to conclusion and gross distortion of the facts.
What an amazing case, Nick. Absolutely amazing. So many witnesses. Unfortunately, a lot of them have died by now. But what do you think of that case?
Well, there's no dispute that something crashed. That's the incredible thing about this. People that are not familiar say, oh, well, the military would deny that, wouldn't they? But that's the point. They didn't. In fact,
the beginning, they said it was a down flying saucer, right?
Absolutely. It was the military themselves that put out, or caused to be put out, a press release. And they used the phrase flying disc. They said, we have recovered, there had been these so-called flying disc sightings in the US and indeed worldwide.
The Foo Fighters.
The Foo Fighters, but particularly then Kenneth Arnold's sighting of 9, I think, disc-shaped
prior
craft.
to Roswell.
Absolutely. And so the military said, well, this mystery, all these flying discs, we have got one of them. So we, the US Army, as it was at the time, had recovered one of these craft.
It was even on the radio, local Roswell radio, from that press release. But then the military recanted. Why?
Well, within 24 hours, yes, absolutely. There was a 180-degree turn, and the military said, we've made a terrible mistake. It was just a weather balloon. Well, wait a minute.
Hello.
The 509th Bomb Group, which was based at Roswell, and it was the intelligence officer there, Jesse Marcel, who was involved in the recovery. The 509th Bomb Group was the only atomic bomb-capable squadron anywhere in the world at the time. So it was the elite military unit. These people were the best of the best. And if ever there's a bunch of people less likely to misidentify a weather balloon, which is something they were perfectly familiar with, they were launched all the time in the area, it was these people.
We both knew the late Jesse Marcel Jr., the son of Jesse Marcel, who carted this and flew this material, these craft, to Wright-Patterson. And he would always tell us that his father told him there was something very unusual here. It was an amazing story.
Well, I remember him saying that I think he was 9 years old at the time, something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and with tears in his eyes as he retold the story, he said that his father came back, woke the family up, and said, I won't be able to keep this, but I want you to see this because everything that I knew, everything that I believed has changed.
Yeah.
And he pulls out this piece of, it's now kind of called memory metal. Incredibly.
Crunch it and it goes right back to its form, right?
Yes. And the family watched with amazement. And the following day, of course, Jesse Marcel Sr. had to take that back to the military. Now, I think that particularly if there was a crash and there's debris, which people, of course, talk about, I think that someone somewhere still has a piece of this. I mean, I think it's human nature. People like souvenirs. People want to hold on to something, particularly if it's a paradigm-shifting, worldview-changing thing. And I've teamed up with the local newspaper, the Roswell Daily Record, and we have a campaign not aimed at the UFO community, but aimed at the citizens of Roswell. And my idea is this.
To get somebody to come forward who may be alive?
Get someone to come forward, but even more than that, going back to the idea that people like souvenirs and mementos, I've said to people, and I've written an editorial, which I was told was the most viewed editorial in the history of the Roswell Daily Record.
It was.
Well, and I said, search your houses. You know, local people, go into your attics.
Somebody has something.
Yeah, look at the little box of trinkets on the mantelpiece. Go up and open the chest of your father or your grandfather's military service records. Go through it. And if you find in there a strange piece of metal, give us a call.
Have you changed your views on Roswell over the years?
Well, I think at first I was quite skeptical of this, but I come back to the point that there's no smoke without fire, and an awful lot of these witnesses had nothing to gain and arguably a heck of a lot to lose.
They made no money. It was nothing.
No, these people weren't speaking out for money. I don't think any of them ever got
Profited
paid
from this.
more than a taxi fare to a TV studio or something like
Right.
that. But of course, the reputational damage that sometimes people get from speaking out about this subject, where still there's this unfair perception with large parts of the media and the public that these are crazy people. So these witnesses put a lot on the line by telling their stories.
What about the mortician who talked about they asked him for small little caskets? I mean, my God, how do you make something like that up?
It's bizarre. I never met him. I think Glenn Dennis.
Glenn
wasn't
Dennis.
it? Yeah, I never met him, but I heard that story. I mean, again, why would you want child-sized coffins? I mean, again, if there's the slightest chance that any of this is true, it's no good saying, oh, but this is 70 years old. I mean, I've changed my mind on this. Yes, I was criticized a few years ago because I said, Roswell's dead. I said, 70 years on, time to move on.
Right.
I was wrong. Of course I was wrong. Thinking about it now, the point is that length of time doesn't matter. If there is some smoking gun piece of evidence out there, it doesn't matter whether it comes out 70 years or 69. So I freely admit that I was wrong to say Roswell was dead. I think it is in many senses almost ground zero for ufology.
Can we realistically go back and investigate a 70-year-old case?
There are some things we can't do. I accept the point that, like any cop will tell you, if you don't crack a case maybe within the first 48 hours, your chances of doing so decline rapidly. The same in the medical community. You'll hear this phrase about the golden hour, I think they use. And generally speaking, with the passage of time, memories fail, recollections are lost, evidence, it can't be secured. But I come back to the point that if there is a piece of this memory metal or some other smoking gun piece of evidence, a document, a film, a photograph, whatever it may be, then even though it's difficult to investigate something 70 years on, it's not impossible. I mean, look, historians all the time are uncovering new records, for example, about the First and the Second World War. We don't say to those historians, oh, the passage of time makes this a pointless pursuit. No, absolutely not.
When I was a young boy, Nick, my mother brought home a magazine from Look magazine that had the story of the Barney and Betty Hill case. John Fuller wrote the book, The Interrupted Journey, but it had to do with this New Hampshire couple that claimed that they were abducted by extraterrestrials. It was an amazing story. I could not put the magazine down. I was just a little kid. I vouched at that moment, I wanted to go into broadcasting to investigate these kinds of stories. I was just fascinated by it. Later on in life, as a 21-year-old radio reporter in Detroit, Michigan, I had the opportunity to interview their psychologist and psychiatrist, Dr. Benjamin Simon. Called him up, and I said, this is George Noory. I work at WCAR Radio here in Detroit. Can we do this interview? And he said, absolutely. And I recorded it. I can't find the tape, Nick. It's too old. It was 1971 when I did the interview with him. But I asked him specifically, I said, were they telling you the truth about their abduction case? And we can get into that case in a second with you. And he said, I don't know, but I'll tell you this, they weren't lying. Whatever happened to them, and he hypnotized them both separately, and they both had the same story, which was unusual. He said, whatever happened to them, they believe it to be true. And that was the major story. It's an amazing case.
It's absolutely incredible. I never met Barney, who died, I think, many years ago. But I did have the opportunity in the 90s, and I think she's now passed too. But
They're both dead.
Yes, but I had the opportunity to meet Betty Hill, and my goodness, what a down-to-earth but still sort of feisty character.
Well, when you met Betty, we've got a clip of her that you've got to see, and then we'll talk more about her. Betty Hill was an amazing person.
Absolutely.
And at that point, it left the top of the mountain, came out over the highway, and stopped in midair directly in front of us, maybe about 50 feet in the sky. So Barney got out with the binoculars in an attempt to identify the craft. And when he looked up, he saw a circular window with a bright light behind it, and he saw these men standing behind the window looking down at him. And at that point, the craft began to descend, and he became frightened. Ran back to the car saying he thought they were trying to capture him. So we got in the car and we went speeding down the highway to avoid capture. And as we're driving along, there's beeping sounds. That sounds like something was hitting the trunk of the car, and the car vibrated. And then we drove along for about another 30 miles when Barney turned off onto a side road. And here were the group of men he'd seen on the craft standing in the middle of this road, blocking our way.
Look at her face, Nick. That woman's not lying.
No. Now, you can have a debate about the extent to which her memory might have been skewed by regression hypnosis, and that's a whole other debate. But no, I from that clip and from having met her personally, sat down in a restaurant with her, spent the whole evening chatting, I have no doubt, like you, that she was telling the truth as she perceived it to be.
As she perceived it. That's exactly what psychiatrist Benjamin Simon said, that she was telling the truth based on what she thinks she saw. Because I wanted him, Nick, at that age, as I was interviewing him, I wanted him to tell me they're lying, or I found out in hypnosis that they're making the story up. But he couldn't say that.
No, I mean, that would have been a big story for you. You would have uncovered a sort of long-running fraud, but you didn't.
No.
And I think it's a classic case. I mean, one point about it, which I think is often overlooked, people are kind of nervous about talking about it for understandable reasons.
Sure.
But Betty was white, Barney was black. Now, for a mixed-race couple to put their heads above the parapet, put themselves into the public eye in 1961 in New Hampshire.
That was unheard of.
Yeah, that was not something that you would want to do. You would not want the attention. I think they were putting themselves in, a difficult, possibly even dangerous situation.
It could have been a dangerous situation.
This was, very different days, and I think that is another reason that, to me, why I say these people were not attention seekers. My goodness, they would have been well advised, I think, to keep quiet, keep their heads down.
I used to think, could this have been some kind of military operation, in that the people that they saw standing by the road weren't extraterrestrials, but military people? And I keep coming back to, no, something dramatic happened to these people in an era where extraterrestrials abducted humans in huge numbers, not just Barney and Betty Hill. That seems to have slowed down a little bit now, don't you think? The abductions like that?
It does, and it's quite interesting to speculate why. Does it? I think there are three different ideas that come to my mind. Firstly, some of the true believers would say, there was a program of some sort that the extraterrestrials were carrying out, and now that program is reaching its conclusion.
Yeah, they've
which
got
is,
their results, they're
you know,
done.
they've got what they needed, which is kind of interesting and a little bit scary and disconcerting itself, because it makes you wonder, well, when that stage finishes, what's coming next?
Exactly.
If I was a little bit more skeptical, though, I
Like
would
David
say...
Jacobs.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
I think, yes. And that is some deeply scary territory. But if I was being more skeptical, I would say that the three big name abduction researchers in the 80s and the 90s were Dave Jacobs, who you've just mentioned, Bud Hopkins,
God
and
rest
John
his soul.
Mack.
That's right, and he's gone too.
And that's my point. I wonder, with my skeptical hat on, whether the tragic death of these two figures, of Bud Hopkins and John Mack, has meant that people don't have really the outlet that they used to. They don't have these prolific two individuals as spokespeople. So I wonder if people are still having these experiences in the same sorts of numbers,
Sure.
but in the absence of Mack and Hopkins, they don't really have the outlet that they used to. So that's my skeptical theory.
I think it's slowed down because of vehicles like my radio show, Coast to Coast. I think more people would be talking about their abduction cases. I've seen that over the last 14 years, Nick, slow down considerably too. There's another case I want to talk with you about, which was in your old neck of the woods in England. Of course, Rendlesham Forest.
As I started to get up off the ground, what formed was a silhouette of a triangular craft that was probably about 20 feet in front of me. I was just totally perplexed by it. As I walked up closer to it, I could feel electricity jumping, like on my clothing and skin, hair. It looked like black glass. It was very shiny. But in the actual skin of this craft, running through it, was different colors. There would be globs of whatever, blue and orange. I was looking for crew compartments, intake, exhausts. It wasn't aerodynamic. I mean, it had no flaps. It didn't have anything that normal aircraft would have.
It's an amazing story, Nick. John Burroughs, former U.S. military officer, he was one of those who was there, actually went up and touched the craft, got sick, I think. What do you think of that story?
Well, John Burroughs and Jim Penniston were probably the two that got closest. I think it was Jim who touched the side of the thing. John certainly believes that some health issues that he had were attributable to probably non-ionized radiation.
Radiation, probably.
And you know, again, skeptics find it easy to dismiss all of this and scoff at it. But a British government document called the Project Condign Study Report it's one of the documents that I mentioned that has been declassified and released. It was an intelligence assessment of the UFO phenomenon, classified secret UK eyes only.
Oh boy.
And one of the lines in that study said it might be postulated that the Rendlesham Forest incident was an example of an occasion where witnesses got too close to a UAP and were exposed for longer time periods than normal to the UAP radiation.
Aha.
Well, John Burroughs had an attorney working on a pro bono basis, working with Jim too, and they'd got nowhere with the VA. But then Pat Frascogna, the lawyer who had been doing this work, went to the VA with this document and said, you denied that my clients were irradiated. Here is a Ministry of Defense intelligence study that might suggest otherwise. And guess what? They settled instantly. Certainly with John. I think Jim has not spoken in public about what his situation is, so I don't want to go there. But John, with John, they settled in full.
What do you think happened there, Nick?
Well, they clearly encountered something truly extraordinary. Again,
In the forest.
in the forest, in Rendlesham Forest, in December 1980. Some people say extraterrestrial, others say interdimensional, some say time travelers from the future, others say some kind of deep black government or military
Secret
project.
operation, yeah.
We don't know. We don't know. What we do know is that even those of us who've looked at this and accessed all the files from within the Ministry of Defense found no conventional explanation. So if it was some secret prototype spy plane or drone, even us with high security clearances in the Ministry of Defense couldn't get access to that explanation, that information, if it was out there, which does suggest maybe it was something else.
Dick, one of the most amazing aspects of World War II in the beginning was the Battle of Los Angeles, where they saw some kind of an object up there, shot 2,000 shells against it, heard pinging sounds. It was an amazing story.
Anti-aircraft guns went into action against unidentified aircraft in the Los Angeles area shortly after 3 a.m. Pacific wartime this morning. The anti-aircraft guns began barking during a blackout ordered by the 4th Interceptor Command at 2:25 a.m. Concussion of the shells could be felt in downtown Los Angeles, 15 miles away. U.S. Army planes quickly took to the dark skies, but whether they contacted the object has not been announced. Army officials say they will not comment until they receive a full report of the action. Although some watchers say they saw airplanes in the air, semi-official sources say they probably were the U.S. Army's pursuit. Several observers say they saw one or more planes spotlighted by 20 or 30 searchlights. The object moved southward, presumably over Huntington Park at the western edge of Los Angeles, and on southward to about Long Beach on the coast.
What a story, Nick. And there was incredible paranoia, people thinking the Japanese were coming here. They had sent balloons that, had little bombs on them. But if this were a blimp, it would have been obliterated by the 2,000 shells that they shot there because some of them did hit the object. What do you think happened there?
Well, yeah, I can only agree with your assessment. And of course, that iconic photograph is almost the proof of all this.
Yeah.
The searchlights had this thing, whatever it was, illuminated. The AAA was going up and was hitting this thing. So if it had been a blimp, a balloon, or even an aircraft from a Japanese carrier, which is, I think, unlikely, but it would have been, as you say, shot down, obliterated. Yeah. But whatever this was, and it's interesting that, again, in that clip, we heard that there were references to aircraft in the plural scene. And again, of course, at the time, we didn't really have the language to talk about anything else except aircraft and blimps. But nowadays, or perhaps shortly after that, we would have talked about flying saucers or UFOs, and now UAP. But at the time, it was just aircraft and blimps. But people say often, why don't UFOs land on the White House lawn? Maybe that's the answer, because they know that when they come down, we start shooting at them.
Well, I suspect, though, Nick, that in this case, we know something that hasn't been revealed to us yet. If they sent up craft to find this, they shot at this, something happened. I think they know what it is, but they never told us.
Again, I think it would require some smoking gun document to come out of an archive somewhere. And that's the great thing about archival research. Sometimes some little piece of information comes out that totally changes people's attitudes about things. I mean, fairly recently I was reading that an old essay written by former Prime Minister Winston Churchill came out, which nobody knew about before, in which he was speculating quite openly about the possibility of alien life.
He was a believer.
Yes, he was. And there's a couple of other later documents which I think pretty much make that point. There's a famous document in which he asks his scientific advisor, what is the truth about flying saucers? What is going on? Please let me have a report.
He believed the universe was so vast that the probability was many that we had extraterrestrial life out there.
Yes, and Churchill, when one looks back now, I think Churchill is clearly a man who stands, with other iconic figures as somebody ahead of his time in many ways in terms of his thinking and his worldview. I mean, Churchill knew a thing or two.
He knew. There's one more case I want to talk with you about, Nick, and that had to do with the late police officer, Lonnie Zamora from Socorro, New Mexico, where he was in his police cruiser and then saw something in the desert which changed his mind forever.
On April 24, 1964, an American police officer named Lonnie Zamora spotted a strange object streak through the sky over a highway outside of Socorro, New Mexico. The object was between half a mile to a mile away, shooting off towards the southwest. It left a trail of bluish-orange flames and made a roaring noise as it passed overhead. Curious as to what it was, Officer Zamora followed the object over a steep hill, catching up with it as it lay rested on the summit. What Zamora saw then has never been adequately explained.
I love this case.
Me too.
It is, and unfortunately, Lonnie has passed on, but he left with us an incredible story, didn't he?
He did, and again, about the only place the skeptics have to go with this is, well, maybe he made it up, maybe it was to try and generate some tourism for the town or whatever. But people that knew Lonnie Zamora, and I didn't, but I've spoken to...
He was a straight shooter.
Yeah, absolutely. Respected in his local community and in his local church, and the last person who would have ever told a lie or played some sort of practical joke that brought down people from Washington, which is, of course, what happened. I mean, there's been speculation, well, maybe the craft was something associated with the embryonic Apollo program.
Right. I thought maybe it might have been a LEM lunar module lander with a couple astronauts running around on the outside, but I kind of, pooed that away.
Well, I think so, yeah. I think when you listen to the story about the acceleration that this object was capable of, plus the fact that if that had been the explanation, now the records would be out.
They'd be there.
And we'd know.
That's right.
Because there's nothing secret now about the early days of the Apollo program.
I mean, we tested the lunar module in the desert, but it didn't go up and keep going like this did. So it's an amazing story. There's another one more last one. 1997 in Phoenix. So many people, thousands of people, saw what they thought was a huge triangular-shaped object.
The first thing that struck me is that they were just in a V-shaped formation. Well, it's at night, and guys wouldn't have been flying in a V-shaped formation, in a Vic. We'd call it a Vic. So they would be in a Vic, and then all of a sudden I realized, wow, I don't see any navigation lights or anti-collision lights. So now I'm looking at 5 lights passing overhead silently at a very slow rate. And it also occurred to me that they were flying too slow to stay in the air if it was an aircraft.
There are all kinds of stories, Nick, about what might have been up there, but I still think the most compelling is that there was an object maybe about a mile long, huge, that they saw over the skies of Phoenix.
I agree, and certainly I've spoken to many witnesses who saw something that night. Some of those people who I've met when I've been to Phoenix, and I've spoken in Phoenix. I now live in Tucson, so it's an area I'm very familiar with.
Yeah.
Yes, and for the skeptics who say, well, this was flares dropped from aircraft that had come from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base.
Or Chinese lanterns.
Yeah, over the Barry Goldwater Range and things like that. Well, you know, one of the witnesses was the governor himself, Fife Symington.
At the time, yeah, exactly.
And, you know, if ever there was someone less likely to misidentify flares, it would be a former military pilot like Fife.
Well, you know, he apologized too. I was on the Larry King show with him, and he admitted he made a mistake because initially when this happened, he held a news conference and had a person in an alien costume standing next to him, and he made fun of it.
Now, this just goes to show that you guys are entirely too serious.
A couple of years later, he kind of changed his tune and said, I don't know what this thing was, but I shouldn't have made fun of it. And to me, that was pretty dramatic for him to basically apologize for what he did.
Yes, and I think a lot of people were very bitter at that. Yes, as you say, he got his chief of staff to dress up in a kind of alien suit and said, I can now tell people, this was a press conference, I can now tell people that the culprit behind these UFO sightings has been exposed. And out came the chief of staff dressed as an alien, and everyone laughed. And he said, and I've discussed this with him, he said the reason he did that is he felt he had to do so because his perception as the governor was that the local community was descending into a state of near hysteria about this, which again just shows you something about the scale of these sightings. And I tell you, for every witness who's come forward and given their story, there are hundreds who haven't. And I've spoken to people who said, Nick, this was so close, I tell you, if I'd thrown a rock up in the air, I would have hit the underside of this thing.
Wow. Nick, you have devoted your career to investigating this phenomenon. In your opinion, what are you chasing?
Well, we like to label things. I think it's one of the things that we humans do. So we kind of get a phenomenon like this, and we try and pigeonhole it and say extraterrestrial, interdimensional, intertemporal, whatever theory we favor. I can't help but wonder whether, you know, this is just our own. It's like if you see a shadowy figure at the foot of your bed.
Right.
If you're religious, you might think it was an angel or a manifestation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. If you are a paranormal investigator, you might think of it as a ghost. If you are a ufologist, you might think you are being abducted. What I'm saying is that we interpret this through the lens of our own cultural background and our own belief system. So we pigeonhole all these things: aliens, ghosts, angels, demons. My theory is that these labels are just very anthropocentric attempts to categorize and define something that may be totally beyond our comprehension.
That could be. When the dust settles, when the files are read, what will we have?
Well, I think we will have, it's what I talk about as sort of, it's a reverse of the normal situation. We'll be able to say what UFOs aren't. In other words, we'll be able to look at all the material in this files and we'll say, look, the government itself, governments all around the world have thrown a huge amount of resources at this and still haven't really, I think, managed to define, well, as I say...
At least to us.
At least to us. What we might not be able to do from all these files is say, that's the answer. And indeed, there may not be a single neat answer to the whole phenomenon. There may be lots of different things going on. But I think what we will be able to say without any doubt is that this is not misidentifications, this is not hoaxes, this is not delusions. Some of it is, of course, but as I always used to say at the Ministry of Defense, the skeptics have to be right every single day, but the believers only have to be right once.
That's right. Nick, thanks for being on Beyond Belief.
Thank you.
We want answers to this incredible story. Are we being visited by extraterrestrial life? People like Nick Pope will continue to investigate to get that answer, whatever it may be. I'm George Noory, and thanks for watching Beyond Belief.